Welcome to the Adoption and Foster Care Journey, a podcast to encourage, educate, and equip you to care for children and youth through adoption, foster, and kinship care. Hosted by an adoptive mom with over 22 years of kinship and adoptive parenting experience. She's on this journey with you. Please welcome Sandra Flach.
Behold, children are a heritage from the Lord. The fruit of the womb a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior are the children of one's youth. Blessed is the man who fills his quiver with them. That is Psalm 127, verses 3 through 5. I am Sandra Flach. Welcome to this episode of the Adoption and Foster Care Journey. Thank you for joining us today. I pray that you will be encouraged through this episode of our podcast today. Grab your notebooks. We have Dr. Jerrod Brown back with us. Dr. Brown is always a wealth of information. If you're driving or walking or doing something where you can't take notes right now, you can always listen to this episode, replay it, and sit down with a notebook and take some notes if you feel like that is something that you want to do. But before we get to Dr. Brown, though, please check out this invaluable resource.
Natalie Vecchione of the FASD Hope podcast and Sandra Flach of the Adoption and Foster Care Journey podcast would like to invite you to join their Hope for the FASD Journey, a virtual support community for parents and caregivers raising individuals with an FASD, diagnosed or not. This faith-based community includes an online bi-monthly support group, a monthly VIP conversation, and a private Facebook group which includes a video devotional from Natalie and Sandra every Saturday. To register, visit justiceforoorphans.ny.org/training/FASD.
While this podcast is not solely FASD focused, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, FASD does affect a large portion of the adoptive and foster community. Most parents and caregivers don't even know initially that that is what may be going on with the big behaviors that their kiddos may be experiencing, because the symptoms of FASD are really behavioral and can look like other things. But as a mom of two kids diagnosed with fetal alcohol syndrome, my boys are now 18 and 20. I know how difficult the parenting journey can be. I know how isolating it can feel. And I want you to know that you are not alone. We've got a support community for you that you just heard about. And I also offer one-on-one FASD coaching sessions for parents and caregivers, along with in-person and online FASD workshops. Now, due to a busy schedule for the month of April, we don't have any workshops scheduled until May. But if you are interested, we are offering a free intro to FASD that is going to be on May 8th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time online. And it's great for parents and caregivers, maybe just wanting to learn a little bit more, or about anybody working with your child or interacting with your child, from grandparents to babysitters to Sunday school teachers, youth group leaders, school teachers, next door neighbors, whoever. If you feel that they would benefit from having a better understanding of FASD while they're interacting with your child, it's a great workshop for them. It's only an hour, it's free, and it'll really be helpful. So that's great for anybody new to the table. If you want something a little bit deeper than just 60 minutes, right? We offer a 3-hour FASD workshop that goes just a little bit deeper than the free 1 hour. This is 3 hours, so we can take a little bit more time, go a little bit deeper. And that one is available. The next one is on Thursday, May 16th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. The intro is not a prerequisite. You could do either or of these workshops, but there certainly will benefit you or anybody who participates because I believe personally, after all of these years of my parenting experience, adoptive parenting experience, raising kids prenatally exposed, we need to be educated and equipped on how to best support our kids for the success of our placements, for the health of our families. And so our kiddos can thrive, because they really can. If we know what we're doing, then we can better support them. So to register for any of the FASD workshops, to learn more about the coaching, the support group, all of that, you can go to our website, justicefororphansny.org, and click on the training tab at the top of the page, and you'll see the drop down FASD, and all of our FASD resources are listed there. And coming up, one of the reasons why I am not doing a training online in April is because I'll be in person in North Carolina for the Renew retreat for foster and adoptive parents. It is April 18th through the 20th in Swansboro, North Carolina, near the beach. This is really a wonderful retreat for foster and adoptive families, parents. Jody Tucker, formerly the International Director of Orphan Sunday. She also is the author of the Second Mothers Bible Study, and she also leads the Second Mothers group. She is the brainchild, I guess I would say, of the Renew Retreat. She's the founder of it, and just does a beautiful job bringing key people who will minister to you, speak to you, share with you. I get to be there, and I'm going to be doing an FASD workshop. I'll have a booth of information, and I'm also going to partake in just all of the other wonderful things offered at the Renew Retreat. So if you're interested in learning more about that, you can go to renewretreat.org. And of course, there are links to JFO and to the Renew Retreat in the show notes for this episode. You can scroll down and find that. So now to our guest. He's got quite the bio I'm going to read because he's got just a wealth of experience and knowledge. He is our resident expert. So Dr. Jerrod Brown is a professor, a trainer, researcher, consultant with multiple years of experience in teaching at the college level. He is the founder and CEO of the American Institute for the Advancement of Forensic Studies. Jerrod has provided consultation services to caregivers, professionals, and organizations on the topics of autism spectrum disorder, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, confabulation, suggestibility. These are things that get our kiddos in trouble, trauma, and other life adversities, including alexithymia. Didn't even know anything about that until we did a whole episode about alexithymia with Dr. Brown, executive dysfunction, criminal recidivism, traumatic brain injury, and youth fire setting. Dr. Brown has completed 4 separate master's degree programs and holds graduate certificates in neuroscience and the law, neuropsychology, autism, other health disabilities, and TBI. In 2021, Jerrod completed his post-doctoral certificate in leadership and organizational strategy and a professional certificate in forensic psychology. In 2023, just last year, he completed a diabetes care and education certificate and currently is pursuing his 5th master's degree in applied clinical nutrition. Jerrod has conducted hundreds of workshops and webinars, published several articles, book chapters, and recently co-edited the book Forensic Mental Health, a source guide for professionals. Dr. Brown has been quoted in various magazines and newspaper articles and is regularly featured on national and international podcasts like this one. He's also a foster parent, so he has some wonderful lived experience now. Please welcome back our resident returning expert, Dr. Jerrod Brown. Hey, Jerrod, welcome back.
Hey, Sandra, how you doing?
I'm doing great, and I'm super interested. I know we talked about this briefly not too long ago, and I said, I am certainly interested in having this conversation, talking about the first 1,000 days of life. So as we begin to unpack that, where exactly does it begin? Does it begin at conception? Does it begin at birth? Let us explain that for us.
Yeah, so the more I learn about this topic, I think this is where it's at, where we really got to focus our energy on as much as possible. So it's day 1 of conception all the way to age 2. And this research shows that between these dates, this is probably the most influential time in a human being's life that we can positively influence outcomes. And unfortunately, this is the time of life too, where the most damage can probably be done that can impact people throughout his or her lifespan. I know we talk about FASD a lot. I mean, one example would be a negative exposure to drugs, alcohol, tobacco, anything just toxic in utero. Now, again, the question sometimes comes up, well, should we not care about age 2.5 or 3 or 4? Of course you should. But the research says this is probably when the brain is developing most rapidly, the body's developing. So the more we can infuse good things into the pregnancy, into the child's early development after birth, that is linked with better outcomes. And we've talked a lot about the ACEs research. I mean, that's a big part of this too. Most of the ACEs research talks about after birth, but we have to be aware of in utero experiences. To me, that is probably more important to be aware of. And then comes what happens after birth. I mean, it's striking, the research out there, but a lot of people don't have training on the in utero world, or a lot of times don't think about it until after the child's born. But we have 9 months of things that can really go wrong in utero that need to be taken into account, that can unfortunately set that child's life up for a life of maybe some more struggles, more supports, more services, things like that.
Yeah. And while we can't control everything, right?
Correct.
I remember, because I have the blessing and great privilege to be a biological mom to 3 kids. And I remember, intentionally planning pregnancies and then making sure I was eating all the right food and getting rest and drinking water and getting some exercise and, all of those things, and agonizing over making sure I was eating the right things and all of that. And then, preparing for labor and delivery and, then, really literally bonding with that baby before the baby is born, which I know is definitely a positive. And then, of course, in those, those early weeks and months of, breastfeeding and just, just taking such great care. And so ideally, optimally, those are all things, right, that contribute to healthier outcomes. Of course, we can't predict, or prevent anything or everything, but when, those optimal, or maybe you can even expound a little bit, optimal circumstances, best outcomes, how crucial is that for those first 1,000 days?
You mentioned probably the key variables that come up in there. Absolutely, all those things are talked about. In this literature, it talks a lot about what is mom eating during pregnancy. That has a lot to do with this. Genetics plays a role here. I mean, some things are outside of the scope. Again,
Right.
You can do all the right things, but maybe the child is still born with something. But in most cases, hopefully, when mom is doing everything we know common sense wise, not using drugs during pregnancy, alcohol, not smoking, maintaining regular contact with one's healthcare provider, having a good support network, all very, very important. But some things that might be out of control that we don't think about. What happens if mom's trying to do everything by the book, but she's just dealing with poverty, lower socioeconomic status, and she wants to eat better, but she just doesn't have the funds? That's a variable. What happens if mom is in an environment, could be a family system environment, where there's a lot of trauma or stress going on? So it's not just what's going on with mom directly, but then look around at her circle of friends and family. Look around at the actual environment she lives in. Could she be living in a home where there's not much she can do about it, but there's mold, there's asbestos, there's lead exposure? Things like that are talked about in this literature. So there's so many different factors to take into account that we can control, and some that we cannot control. You mentioned attachment as well. Attachment starts in utero. A lot of times people think attachment starts after birth, but you and I have had discussions on other podcasts about attachment-based traumas in utero. So if it's an unwanted pregnancy and mom is pregnant and has no interest in being pregnant, that's been linked to poor outcomes in and of itself. So attunement, empathy, validation, singing to your baby, playing with your child. I mean, all of these things we know are so, so important. And if you look at the literature on the first 1,000 days of life, it talks about this is the time that holds the greatest opportunity, but also the greatest point in a child's life where they're maybe most fragile, where we have to be aware that there could be insults to the pregnancy, environmental, neurotoxins, the nutritional factor. And if people are doing everything by the book, growth is usually improved, birth outcomes are improved. This plays a critical role in future learning, thriving throughout the lifespan. All of these things are talked about during the first 1,000 days of life research literature.
So fascinating for sure. So the variables or the events that would have a negative impact on a developing baby, on a child up to 2 years during the 1,000 days of life. Talk to us about some of those things. You've mentioned some of them, but I keep thinking about our kiddos who are, who come to us. Many of our listeners are adoptive and foster parents, kinship caregivers, not great experiences our kids are having before they come to us. So talk about those things.
Poor nutrition, maybe overnutrition of foods that might not be good. So if a mom is consuming only fast food during pregnancy, but getting tons of calories, that could still be not good. Excessive sugar consumption, excessive caffeine consumption, maternal obesity is talked about that could impact fetal development outcomes. So if mom is really chronically overweight during pregnancy, that could be a factor. Genetic factors, of course, have to be considered. Is mom dealing with any kind of chronic diseases or illnesses during pregnancy? Maybe she has really bad dental health during pregnancy and she doesn't go to the dentist. There's some infections going on. All of those things impact mom and the developing child in utero. Substance use, exposure to environmental toxins. So maybe mom lives very close to a factory, or maybe she works in a factory during pregnancy and there's lots and lots of fumes and just things like that she's breathing in throughout the pregnancy. Certain kinds of medications, I'm not going to open that door too much, but certain kinds of medications could adversely impact fetal development. So really staying in contact with your healthcare provider. Hormonal dysfunction, very important to be aware of that. That could be a possible red flag indicator of gut dysbiosis or digestive health problems or gut brain health access. If mom's dealing with a ton of stress during pregnancy that's unmanaged, and maybe mom has very poor coping skills and she just can't handle that stress, that's been linked to more problematic outcomes. Lots and lots of things. The environment, as I mentioned before, but look beyond the household. What's going on in the neighborhood? People are surprised to learn how many studies have been published on community dysfunction and neighborhood dysfunction. So if someone lives in a neighborhood where every time they leave their home, they're afraid, maybe they're afraid that there's lots of gang activity, lots of poverty, lots of homelessness, lots of drugs and alcohol. If people want to learn more about that, look at the community dysfunction literature, neighborhood dysfunction, health disparities. Was mom during pregnancy? This is another variable that maybe we don't think about enough, and there is research on this. Was mom dealing with marginalization, oppression, or racism during pregnancy? So we have prenatal racism exposure. There's actually studies that have looked at that, and that has been linked with more problematic birth outcomes. We could talk a lot about, obviously, prenatal alcohol exposure. There's a huge literature base on prenatal smoking exposure, prenatal lead exposure, prenatal poverty exposure, prenatal air pollution. The list goes on. Prenatal meth, cocaine, marijuana exposure. Is there any of those topics, Sandra, that you want me to go a little bit deeper into? I mean, that's just a small snapshot. But again, anything we know that's probably not good for an adult, if that's happening to a mom during pregnancy, that's impacting mom and the pregnancy probably on a not so good level.
Yeah, it's so fascinating to me because I can, if I think about my especially my two youngest boys who have an FAS diagnosis, right? They were adopted internationally, but from what we know, because the birth mom had 4 children and we have adopted all 4 of them. The older children, less exposure to a lot of things, and were in an orphanage at a little bit of an older age, like age 3 and 5. Our youngest 2, mom had already lost the first 2 to the orphanage system. In Ukraine, there wasn't a foster care system like we have in the United States. So you can compare it to children going into foster care, right? So you have siblings, but knowing that alcohol was definitely played a role, there was probably a lot of the other factors of, poverty, of, we don't know if there was drug use. We know there could have been domestic violence. We know nutrition was terrible. All of those things. Mom, probably didn't have any prenatal care. So for our 2 guys had, so just in utero, all of those strikes against them, so to speak. And then mom, knowing her first 2 were in an orphanage, or if they were in the United States, say 2 are already in foster care, then the next 2 pregnancies, she knew she wasn't going to keep. She knew she wasn't going to parent. And in this instance, she went to a hospital to deliver, and then she left the hospital and abandoned these 2 babies in the hospital, right? So there was already that clearly, or at least understandably, I can imagine she wasn't really connected with these, babies growing inside of her womb. She knew she wasn't going to keep them. That was her plan. She did it twice, right? Left them, abandoned them in the hospital. So they went right into an orphanage where then for the next, one of our kiddos we adopted at 3. So he spent the first 3 years of his life in the institution, and the other one spent the first 5 years. So all of those things would have such a negative impact on not just the first 1,000 days, but beyond that, but on the development of these children.
Very tragic cases. When we think of the complex histories of women who may give birth to a child with FASD or a child who's exposed to other kinds of substances, and it's different. Every case is different, but there are some studies that point to the fact that trauma histories, like you said, are going to be more common. But we also have to be aware of the topic of intergenerational transmissions of trauma. So what happened not just with mom in her experience in the moment, but then go back to her mom, go back to her grandma. What happened to them intergenerationally if there's been trauma in that family system passed down? That can be a factor. Level of fear is a big factor. So for some of these women with these complex histories, if they're terrified during the pregnancy process for a variety of reasons, including maybe they're afraid that they know that they're going to lose their child to the child welfare system or whatever system it is, that's another factor. Unfortunately, too, for some of these women, they deal with a high rate of stigma. So they're afraid to reach out for help. So if you're dealing with a lot of stigma, what can happen? Increases in depression, anxiety, fear, loneliness, helplessness, hopelessness. And if you're pregnant, having those feelings day in and day out, those are all toxic stressors. And there's an argument to be made. They're probably trauma reactions. So all of that is impacting mom and that child in utero or in early childhood, depending on the family system. Now, Sandra, you mentioned again, your children had a lot of different kinds of traumas. I want to give people hope that even if during that first 1,000 days of life, there's a lot of tough stuff that happened, we have to keep trying interventions. Things can still get better. It may be a little more difficult. It may take more time. It may require more service providers with different expertise in a variety of areas. But any child, regardless of age, can get better, in my opinion. Now, is it going to be cured? I just want to be realistic. Probably not if we're talking about really complex trauma histories, in utero experiences. But things can, I think, get a lot better with the right environment and the right supports.
And that's definitely, we need hope and encouragement along the way. So when there's these negative events, or environments, all of these things, whether it's prenatal alcohol exposure, whether it's trauma, any of the things that you've talked about, what are some of the negative outcomes? Like, how does this affect the developing child?
Inattention. So some of these kids might be more likely to look like they have ADHD, concentration issues. They might have more internalizing problems as they get older. So more problems with guilt and shame in some cases, anxiety, depression, loneliness. For some of these children, depending on the supports they've had or the lack thereof, they might have more externalizing behavioral problems and be more likely to come into contact with the justice system as adults. Now, by no means am I saying a child has all of these things that equals criminal justice involvement. But if that child had all of these things and then no supports in place, no good family structure, the likelihood of that happening goes way up. School problems, academic performance issues, executive function impairments are talked about frequently. So problems a lot of times with working memory, their brain's post-it notes, inhibition, our brain's kind of parking brake, cognitive flexibility issues where sometimes the person has a really hard time being adaptable, being flexible. A lot of times, unfortunately, with these really complex trauma histories or in utero experiences, we're going to see more social skill impairments. So you might see problems with friendship making, gullibility, suggestibility, getting along with people in a group setting, a lot of times being taken advantage of. And those are just a few things to consider. And like all the FASD discussions we've had, many of these things can present similarly to FASD symptoms, other kinds of prenatal experiences. So it does get complicated if the child comes to you when they're a little older and you have no birth records, because a lot of times there's so many things going on and we just don't know. Could it be FASD? Maybe. Could it be just extensive childhood trauma with attachment problems? Definitely. Could it be the result of some sort of other exposure to drugs or environmental contaminants? Definitely. Could it be a traumatic brain injury history? Unfortunately, for some of these kids growing up in a home where there's lots of chaos and trauma, they may have sustained a head injury from child abuse as well. So very tragic cases. But regardless, all of these things can be improved with the right intervention. Now, for some of these kids too, again, it may be more challenging than not, but some of the interventions we can talk about in a few minutes, I can definitely give a lot of tips and strategies to take into account.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question, but I also just in observing, pondering this, it's many of our kids, and I'm thinking of our listeners, many of the kids that we're caring for have multiple, of these adverse outcomes, whether it be prenatal exposure, the lack of attachment of the birth mom, abandonment, just all, poverty. There could have been domestic violence in the household, all of those things, early neglect, malnourishment, maltreatment, so a lot of our kids have actually had several of those negative impacts, right? Not just one. So that's important. Even a lot of times with the alcohol drinking, there could be drug use and cigarette smoking, right? And all of those things are going on. So Yeah. So again, our listeners, adoptive and foster parents, our kids most likely, experienced at least one, if not multiple of these different types of adversities. So what can we do to best support our kids, so that they can have better outcomes?
First and foremost, learn about these topics, know what they are, know the terms, know where to look, become informed. I think that's the
Yeah.
starting point. Because if you don't know what you don't know. So then, unfortunately, too, and I don't know every healthcare provider out there, mental health person, but in my experience, there's very few trainings that are out there that use the term the first 1,000 days of life. Anytime I talk about this, a lot of times people have never heard that concept, that term before. Once you get into the weeds, we all know it's all common sense, but really learn about this. There's some really good TED Talks you can find on YouTube. If you just type in the first 1,000 days of life, several. I've listened to every one of them. I think they're great. So what do we need to be aware of? Again, everything we talked about before, as much as humanly possible. And again, I know we can't control, especially if you are a foster adoptive care parent, but what that child eats has a lot to do with this. What mom ate during pregnancy is a big part. Focusing on attachment, so stability, safety, attunement, understanding empathy. I'd give you guys some other search terms, and I think we've done podcasts recordings on all these topics. Learn about theory of mind, which is perspective taking. Learn about mentalization, which is very similar to theory of mind. Learn about the topic of joint attention and mind-mindedness and social referencing. These are all things, if you want to become an attachment-informed parent, you have to know what these topics mean. And we've talked about these topics at various times in the series we did on trauma. Look at your home environment. Again, all common sense, but is your home structured in a way that is rooted in safety, stability, parental warmth, having good parenting skills, staying regulated as a parent?
Yeah.
Because we all get stressed, things are tough, and there's no doubt about it. Raising a child that has these complex histories can be very, very stressful. A lot of these kids don't sleep well, unfortunately. A lot of these kids have gut health issues. So if the child is not sleeping well, caregivers often aren't sleeping well. So getting sleep under control as much as possible, very important. This literature also really stresses the importance of really starting to engage the child in appropriate play behaviors as early on as possible. So for some of these kids, I think they would do quite well working with like an equine therapist, play therapist, art therapist. These are some really good things I think that can help support and enhance healthy child development. Protection from harm is strongly recommended in this literature. Having caregivers who are very responsive as well. Responsivity is part of attunement. If that child is in distress, not ignoring the child. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, Sandra, but how long do you let your child cry in their crib for? I've heard different things from different people, but I am under the impression and belief you don't let your child cry too much, especially if they've had these extensive, complex trauma histories, because they already have a very sensitive nervous system and fractured attachment patterns. If you just let them cry and cry and cry, that just amplifies their stress level. They may not be able to articulate it, but I think their body can feel it. Thoughts on that, Sandra, from your opinion?
I know having three biological children, I never liked that. Some parents would give that advice, oh, let them cry it out, they'll be fine. I never even liked doing that with my biological children. And then when it comes to children who've experienced that rejection and that abandonment and that trauma, I knew, our kids came older, right? So they weren't babies, but I knew that, even sending them to their room as a punishment or a discipline was not in their best interest as well, because it just reinforces that rejection. But my kids, I had to, especially my littler ones, they were 3 and 5 when they came. I had to sort of go above and beyond and really, really dote on them, because they didn't cry when they felt pain. They didn't, come asking for anything. So I had to always like make a big deal out of the littlest boo-boo, so that I could demonstrate, I'm going to care for you. I'm going to take care of you. Because they learned early on in the orphanage, when you cry, nobody comes. Nobody's going to help take your pain away.
Very sad situation. I'm so sorry, seriously. And that a couple things that jump out at me when you say that. Understanding sensory processing. This literature talks about providing the child with a stimulating and enriching environment. But I'll get pushback on that from some people. Oh, my child gets overstimulated easily. So working with a sensory processing specialist to find out, maybe an evaluation that area, what's appropriate, what's not for your child. Bright lights might be a trigger. Understimulation could be a trigger. So there's a fine balance there. Definitely. Staying in contact with one's healthcare provider, highly recommended. Parenting classes. We all can use parenting classes. There's no shame in that, because a lot of times I think maybe some parents think, okay, I raised my biological child, everything turned out. It's not the same ballgame when raising a child with FASD or some complex trauma histories. Get some training in this. There's no shame in that. There's so much I don't know. I want to keep learning and growing. So find someone that understands these topics, because when you're raising a child with these complex needs, first and foremost, you got to be trauma and attachment informed, probably executive function informed. I would argue gut brain health axis informed, understand the central nervous system. These are just some basic things you definitely want to take into account. I can give a few more if you'd like, or anything else, Sandra, you would like me to tackle or think about?
Yeah, no, this is wonderful. We can round it out with, the few more that you'd like to share. I'm sure that we're all taking notes because there's so much to unpack here. But yeah, any guidance that will help us to better support our kids is welcome.
Well, childhood play, again, you might want to really look at that. Just childhood play in general is really stressed as a critical component to enhancing brain development, but it also plays a huge role in physical, social, and emotional development. Childhood play also plays a role in empathy development and theory of mind development for kids in general. So finding a good play therapist, very important for some of these children. If they were institutionalized for a long period of time, or they dealt with neglect, they might not know how to interact with other kids that well, because maybe they were unfortunately locked in their room for hours and hours and hours on end. They don't know how to play with other people. So starting out small like that can be very helpful. Art, again, depending on how old the child is, starting to engage the child and with different art projects, finding an art therapist can be very, very helpful. Music has been shown to be very helpful. Even listening to music while pregnant. Great. And I'm not talking about really hardcore music, like calm, soft, age-appropriate music, of course. Reading to your child, huge literature base on reading and positive childhood outcomes. And even reading to your child while pregnant. I mean, these are all things that form healthy attachment patterns. And another thing, too, that people are surprised to learn, I mean, they're probably not, but there's a lot of research literature on promoting happiness within your family system, and how happiness and joy is linked with better childhood brain development, better outcomes, better intellectual functioning, better physical development, improved self-esteem. It can even play a role in helping that child enhance their self-regulation abilities as well. So those are a few other things before I kind of wrap it up with like a whole bunch of things that I've talked about. And just to recap, other areas, Sandra, you want me to go deeper in the weeds with, or?
This has been fabulous. I'm always fascinated on, sometimes I do have that thought. The more I learn, it's like, how did any of us get out of the womb or out of childhood without major negative consequences, right? Because there's so many variables that are beyond the parent's control, really. But dialing it down to my audience, and like I said, we're all adoptive foster parents, kinship caregivers. We're all parenting kids that have come from childhood trauma, probably prenatal exposure. There's been attachment problems. There's, that neglect, just all of those adverse childhood experiences. So the more we learn to be able to better support our kiddos and look for those opportunities, I think we always have to be curious. And as we get to know our kids, if they seem artistic, like you mentioned, pursue, those ways where they can actually, use art as a form of therapy. The same with, whether it's music, play. I found with my youngest, especially, he came to us, and looking back, eventually I learned about fear and the impact of fear, right? So we disarmed fear through just play, and he didn't have experience with play. Yes, he was in an institution. There were other children, but it was like he didn't know how to play with toys. He didn't know how to manipulate toys or have, using the imaginative play, that kind of thing. So we had to teach that, but we used a lot of play to disarm fear, to build trust, and to build that connection. I think those are some very important factors in helping our kids.
So what you were doing there was a lot of great things, but with what you were doing that you didn't say is that you're probably doing some amygdala training. Amygdala dysfunction in the brain is really part of our fear center and high emotionality. So a lot of kids with trauma may have an amygdala that's overactive or not working properly. So they have unusual fear responses, high emotionality. So the amygdala, big topic in the brain from a neuroscience lens. If you have children that have high emotionality or extreme fear responses, you probably want to look at the amygdala and interventions that can help calm that down as well.
Yeah.
Very, very important neurological topic to be aware of.
Yeah, definitely. So anything else you want to share?
Well, there's a lot of things I threw at all of you, and it reminds me of why it's important for all of us to look through a neuropsychosocial lens. Basically, what that is, again, neuroscience, biological, could be hormones, blood sugar issues, circadian rhythm misalignment, a lot of things going on biologically with children that have had these extensive trauma histories. The psycho component, more the psychology, the emotions behind it, and then the social aspect, social skills. So neurobiopsychosocial. Common sense things, again, we all know, but just to recap, what are things we can do to support really our health, the child's health, their brain development, body development? Get good sleep. Get a sleep study for your child. If, on just my opinion, any child that's in the foster care adoptive arena, if they've had these complex histories, look at sleep, talk to a sleep specialist. More times than not, the child probably has something with sleep that's maybe not working at optimal levels. Work with a nutritionist. Look at the literature. I'm not giving nutritional advice here, but look at possible nutrition interventions after consulting with your healthcare provider. There's lots of research literature on nutrition the first 1,000 days of life. There's a pretty good handful of studies too that look at nutritional interventions for folks on the autism spectrum, ADHD, FASD, trauma histories. Become attachment and trauma informed.
Yeah.
Look at your own self-regulation abilities. Again, stay just kind of regulated. Find outlets, join a support group, get a parenting group going. Maybe there's no parenting groups in your area. that focus on all these topics. Maybe form one and learn together. Read to your child, play with your child, consider consulting with a play therapist, a music therapist, equine therapist, looking at social skill limitations. Early intervention in the social skill arena can make the world of difference. And again, just look at your network, look at what's going on in your household, have dinner together, reduce screen time exposure, and create an environment that you can laugh together, enjoy life together, and use warm, positive, healthy parenting practices.
All such wonderful advice, and I know all based in science and with the research. And I'm just so grateful to have you back on the show. And you always teach us so much, Dr. Brown. Thank you for sharing your expertise. I know you'll be back again next month. We're going to talk about something called neuroparenting.
It's very exciting. So,
yeah,
bringing neuroscience into parenting practice, and part of that, really part of it is understanding the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus. Give a lot of things to think about: executive function, metacognition, working memory, abstract reasoning. If you can understand those topics, it will help you, I truly believe, be more patient and more understanding, and help provide you with different insights, ideas, and approaches that may lead to better outcomes.
Well, we look forward to that conversation, and thank you so much for being with us today.
You're welcome. Thanks, Sandra.
Wow. Always a wonderful conversation with Dr. Jerrod Brown. I always learn so much. And I hope that you're finding that to be the case too. Thank you for listening to this episode. Again, I hope that you were educated, supported, encouraged by our conversation with Dr. Brown. He's always so helpful. And I am passionate about encouraging you and equipping you for your parenting journey. I'm on this journey with you. I'm still caring for 2 kids at home, an 18-year-old and a 20-year-old, both adopted internationally, significant trauma, both diagnosed with fetal alcohol syndrome. So as a parent and caregiver, and as somebody who went and got some professional training, and I'm now a facilitator of the Facets Neurobehavioral Model, all of that experience, I know how hard this journey can be, and I'm passionate about providing resources and support and everything that you need to help you along your parenting journey. So you heard about our podcast, or this podcast is definitely a resource, but you heard about our support group earlier, Hope for the FASD Journey. I hope that you'll consider that, especially if you're confident that one of your kiddos or more than one of your kiddos was prenatally exposed. That's a support network that I find to be vital. It's a group that I wish I had many, many years ago when I started out on this parenting journey. For sure, we offer that to you, as well as the coaching, and as well as the online and in-person workshops. And of course, if you're listening to this podcast, I really, trust and hope that it is also a vital resource for your parenting journey and some encouragement for you each week as we release these episodes. So learn more about all of the resources at our website, justicefororphansny.org. To find the FASD specific resources, you'll want to click training at the top of our website homepage, and you'll see the drop down will say FASD, and that's where you'll go to get all of the training and the support group and all that information there. And of course, there is a link in the show notes. If you enjoyed this episode, please, please, please be sure to subscribe, follow, leave a review, all of those great things. We are on all of those podcast platforms, and the video version of this podcast is available on YouTube. Justice for Orphans has a YouTube page. If you're watching today from YouTube, or you're watching the audio or the video version, you'll see behind me is a different view. I am up at our camp in the upstate New York Adirondacks. And today is actually the day of the solar eclipse, and we're here. We've been here all week for spring break, but we stayed a couple extra days because where our camp is in the path of that totality, 100%. We're going to get to see the eclipse in just a couple of hours from when I am recording this. So the background looks a little bit different than my normal studio. So I'm recording remotely. But either way, I trust that you are enjoying this podcast, would love a review, would love for you to follow, subscribe, all of those things, as well as check us out on social media. Justice for Orphans is on Facebook, Instagram, and on LinkedIn. And I myself, Sandra Flach, I am on all of those platforms as well. And I would love to connect with you there. So make sure that you find and follow us there. And now that we're at the end, I just want to thank you for hanging in there. I'm grateful that you spent your valuable time with us today. Grateful to have you along for the journey. See you next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Adoption and Foster Care Journey podcast, brought to you by Justice for Orphans. We hope you were encouraged today. Please be sure to subscribe to this podcast and leave a review, and share it with your fellow foster and adoptive parent friends so they can be encouraged too. Be sure to find and follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Justice for Orphans. And check out our website for vital resources at justicefororphansny.org.